let's talk about some of the things that have surprised me in Colombia. Hi all, I'm Ezrado and you're watching my travel channel where I talk all things Colombia. So last year I did a video where I dispelled 5 common misconceptions that people often have about Colombia, which you can check out here or via the link in the description below. In that video I focused more on the broad, widespread beliefs about Colombia, but in this video I wanted to dive into some of my own personal misconceptions about the country prior to living there. I think this is something we're all guilty of when it comes to moving to or visiting any new country. We all like to envision what things will be like, for better or for worse, and it's inevitable that there are going to be some things that we get completely backwards in our imaginations. For this video, I wanted to debunk just 5 of these misconceptions I made myself, and who knows, maybe it'll clear up some myths for you too if you happen to share any of these ideas. So the first of these preconceived notions that I had was that people in Colombia would be practically universally warm and friendly. Now, if you think about this for more than a second, it's not hard to realize that it's a pretty unreasonable expectation. Obviously, there are kind people and there are hostile people in every country of the world, regardless of whatever reputation the country has for its friendliness. Be that as it may, when all I ever heard about was how friendly Colombians were, it started to become a given for me, and I wouldn't have even thought to consider that there may also be a bunch of people who aren't so warm. Turns out, though, that not everyone is the embodiment of Mr. Rogers, surprise, surprise. If you happen to buy into this belief, then you may be in for a rude awakening the moment you arrive at the airport, as the people at border control and the security can often be pretty cold, as is often the case when it comes to bureaucracy in general. You might assume this to be the case everywhere in the world, but I'd actually go as far as saying that bureaucracy in Colombia can be particularly impersonal. Now, okay, that's an extreme example, and I really should point out that by and large, yes, Colombians can be some of the friendliest people in the world. The important thing to realize when hearing that though is that it doesn't mean you're never going to come across people who are less than affable. In fact, when it comes to day-to-day encounters with strangers like taxi drivers, store workers, and other people where it's more of a transactional interaction, I wouldn't say I noticed a huge difference in how amiable people were compared to my own country. Now, don't get me wrong, you will likely brush shoulders with people who are especially warm and sociable, and these encounters can even be fairly frequent, but you'll also probably have just as many experiences where this isn't the case. Obviously, this isn't to say that everyone else is mean and hostile, although those kinds of people certainly exist, like in bureaucracy, as I mentioned before. All I'm saying is not to expect some hyper level of enthusiasm from every person you talk with. People are people, Colombia isn't some gregarious utopia, so just be sure to keep your expectations in check. What I will say is that if you really want to experience true kindness and meaningful connection, the most common place I've found this is in actual friendships I've formed with Colombians. When you actually form relationships with people, I've found that Colombians are very hospitable people more often than not. The thing to realize here is that, like most of Latin America, Colombians are often very passionate people, and by that I mean that they're very serious about the things that are important to them. So if you become important to someone, i.e. you form a real bond with someone, then they'll likely treat you with great affection and loyalty, even if they are a little tardy to meet up with you sometimes. But that's a point for another day. Anyway, my next preconception, on the contrary, wasn't something I was actually worried about, but ended up being pleasantly surprised by. I know a lot of you are probably guessing this will be something to do with safety, but actually it's something else entirely. See, I'm a bit of a film buff, and so one of my favourite things to do for fun is going to see movies in the cinemas. Even as movie theatres have dwindled in their popularity and people opt to stream stuff at home, I always choose the cinema experience whenever I can when it comes to films I'm excited for. With this in mind, perhaps the biggest sacrifice I felt I was making when moving to Colombia was the ability to go to the cinema. Why? Well, because Colombia is a Spanish-speaking country, which I assumed would mean that all movies would exclusively be dubbed in Spanish. And look, I can definitely speak and understand Spanish, okay, but I'm by no means fluent and definitely not up to the task of understanding an entire film in the language yet. So I went in accepting the idea that I might just have to give this cinema-going pastime up. That is, until I realised I was wrong. See, as it turns out, the majority of movies showing in cinemas not only have sessions where the movie is dubbed in Spanish, but also sessions where the film's presented in its original language, usually English. Sometimes for smaller movies or animated movies, these sessions can be less common, but if you're in a big city like Bogota or Medellin, you're still likely to be able to find a few somewhere without too much hassle. Outside of these exceptions though, you will generally find non-dubbed sessions in most places, even the smaller cities like Manizales. Also worth pointing out that these sessions will virtually always have Spanish subtitles on screen, as indicated on the cinema's website, but to me that's a very small price to pay if it means being able to see a movie in English. Anyway, if you want to hear more about what the cinema experience in Colombia is like, I've actually done a whole video about that, which you can check out via the link in the description. Moving on to my next assumption that I got wrong though, let's talk about financial expenses. You might imagine, as I did, that things in Colombia are cheap as chips across the board, and that no matter what you throw your money at, you'll never be spending as much as you would be at home. The reality, however, isn't quite this extreme, so I'd recommend tempering your expectations a little. First of all, it is true that Colombia is a much more affordable country, generally speaking. For instance, I found the amount of rent you pay per week for an apartment in Sydney, Australia is often equivalent or even more than what you pay for an entire month's worth of rent in Colombia, and that's for more or less the same standard of apartment in one of the country's more expensive cities. Public transport is also dirt cheap, and Ubers and taxis are of a similar price I'd pay for the bus or train in Australia, which is kind of insane. Also, eating out can often be ridiculously cheap if you find a smaller independent restaurant, to the point where it may even be cheaper than what it costs to buy ingredients for home cooking in your home country. So that might sound cool and all, but to be honest, these were really the main areas of life where I found myself to be saving significantly. It's true that most things are at least somewhat cheaper than the prices you'll see at home, but for a lot of things, the price difference isn't quite as extreme as it is with those examples I just gave. Supermarket products, for instance, are certainly more affordable, but they're usually more in the ballpark of, say, 10 to 30% cheaper, definitely not half price or anything that extreme. Technology, meanwhile, was usually just as expensive as what I've found in Australia, and sometimes even more so. There are some cheaper Colombian or Latin American brands you'll find on occasion, but those are generally considered budget options and aren't generally made to stand neck and neck with the flagship products from big international brands. For those big name brands, don't expect them to lower their prices for the Colombian market. As said, sometimes you might even find them to be more expensive due to higher import costs. Another thing I found to be surprisingly expensive in Colombia was, and I know this is pretty random, socks and underwear. I really don't know why this is, but whenever I went to an Éxito or Falabella, which are like the country's main department stores, I noticed they often only seem to stock designer brand socks and underwear. Then if there was anything less than designer, the range would be incredibly limited. I don't doubt that you can buy these things cheaper in Colombia, as when you go on these department stores' websites, they do seem to list some with more reasonable prices, but this definitely hasn't been my in-store experience, and I've been to a lot of these stores across the country. Anyway, I think you get the point. Yes, Colombia can be cheaper when it comes to a lot of the most important things, but just don't expect cheap prices across the board. While we're on the topic of buying things though, there was another misconception I had here, only this time regarding the stores themselves. See, if you're from a first world country, you might be used to shopping at chain stores. In Australia, for instance, there are chains for every category you could think of. If you need furniture, you could go to Freedom, Fantastic Furniture, or IKEA. If you want to buy tech, you could go to JB Hi-Fi or Harvey Norman. If you want to buy office supplies, you could go to Officeworks, or for anything arts and crafts related, you go to Spotlight. I could go on, but you get the point. For any need you have, there's a chain for it that has stores all over the country, so you really need to search around much. In Colombia, on the other hand, this isn't always a guarantee. Like, they got department and supermarket chains, but when it comes to anything more niche than that, a lot of the market is filled by small independent businesses rather than large chains. After a while, I got to know a few chains here and there, like K-Tronics for technology, or Home Center for home hardware, or Panamerica for books, but beyond those, I really can't think of many other specialist chains at all. I understand that this is good for local businesses and probably good for the economy that you don't have large companies making a monopoly in any given industry, but for the customer, it does make shopping a little trickier. If there's anything that isn't common enough to be sold at one of the few chain stores, then it means you'll have to get savvy with Google to try and track down a local store that may or may not sell it, without any way of knowing in advance, since most of these local businesses don't show their stock on their websites. In fact, a lot of these businesses don't have any website at all, and the best you can hope for is a Google listing that's not out of date. I know that sounds a bit pessimistic, but I've had experiences where I've gone to the address a business put on their Google listing, only to find that it's not there, presumably because the business has either moved or closed down. What this ultimately means then is that your buying options will often feel a lot more limited in Colombia. There aren't really enough chain stores to cover every category of product, and then when it comes to independent stores, it's kind of the Wild West. There might be a store somewhere out there that has what you're looking for, but without a way to check online, it may take you a while to track the product down, if not the store itself on occasion. When you put all of these together, I think you really start to get an idea of how much less convenient life in Colombia can be. Unfortunately, this isn't just the case for shopping, but a lot of other things too, like bureaucratic procedures or public transport. I've said it before, but really some of the best advice I can give for living in Colombia is to be as self-sufficient as you can be, as the less you rely on Colombian services to get by, the less problems you'll likely run into. I know it sounds harsh, of course there are a lot of other great things about the country, but convenience just isn't very high on the list, I'm afraid. I wanted to end this video on a positive note though, so for my last pick, let's talk about something that wasn't an inconvenience to me, despite me thinking it might be. I'm talking about Wi-Fi. Now, when it comes to Colombian telecommunications companies, I have experienced some aggravation, to say the least, at least when it comes to Claro, but more on that in next week's video. Still, this isn't a backhanded compliment, as I did generally find the Wi-Fi in Colombia to be pretty good. I rarely had issues with slow speeds or random disconnects or anything else during my time in the country. This was something I had concerns about before I went for the first time, as I'd seen several expats on YouTube mention that the Wi-Fi in the city they were in wasn't that great, and I'd also had some not so great experiences with Wi-Fi in Brazil, so I figured, you know, is it really going to be infinitely better the moment you cross over the border into Colombia? Well, after living there for almost a year, what I've learned is that any bad experiences I've had, or anyone else has had, were likely just isolated incidents in the place they were staying and aren't usually indicative of the country's internet quality overall. When I went to Brazil, I probably just got unlucky, but I shouldn't assume that my experience was the norm across the country, as I was only there for 3 weeks and didn't stay in enough places to really get an average idea. I'd imagine that it's the same story for the expats who say that Colombian internet is bad. They've probably only visited 1 or 2 places and were unlucky with their experience, and then just assume that that's what it must be like across the entire city or country, when it's in fact not. So yeah, if this is something you're worried about, I can say with confidence that it's not something to lose sleep over. Unfortunately, I can't show you a speed test or anything, as I'm not in the country right now, but from my experience, I can say it's honestly fine on the whole. Nothing to write home about, but it wasn't something I ran into problems with much, which is really what matters for most people at the end of the day. With that though, I've reached the end of my list here. Those were 5 misconceptions I had about Colombia, which I've since flipped on. But if there are any ideas you have about the country which you're not sure about, let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to help you. Otherwise, feel free to like, subscribe, bell, leave a video suggestion if you like, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao!